thank you very much for being here this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be sharing the podium with Barbara Hendricks. I won't say anything about Barbara's musical career, because I think that anybody who loves music in this world will know who Barbara is. But as Jochen very briefly mentioned just now, Barbara is not only one of the most famous and most extraordinary classical singers in the world, she's also a woman with a great big heart and a woman of action. And so in today's talk we will focus particularly in that facet of her life. As Jochen said, Barbara has been working and supporting UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, for many years, in spite of her youth. In fact, she's the longest serving UNHCR Goodwill ambassador. So anyway, great to be here with you, Barbara. Maybe I'll start with an obvious question. I know that Switzerland is very close to your heart, and that you are also now a Swiss national. You're also familiar to Verbier. So just wanted to ask you to begin with, how does it feel to be here today?
Hello, bonjour. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be up in Verbier. I was really a little bit torn, because I wouldn't mind being up on the slopes, especially this morning when I saw the sun. Well, Switzerland is my home. Switzerland means for me my home, music, my family, my children, and the UNHCR, because UNHCR offices are in Geneva, as well as many of our partners, our humanitarian partners, are here in Switzerland. The year after I moved to Switzerland, which was in 1985, when my daughter was just 1, I received a phone call from a man named Leon Davicio, who was working for the UNHCR. And the UNHCR had decided to start a Goodwill Ambassador program, a little bit like what UNICEF had been very successful with people who also lived in Switzerland, like Audrey Hepburn, Peter Ustinov. I must admit that when he came to me to talk about the UNHCR, I'd never really heard of it. I mean, I'd heard of it, but it didn't stick. And that really became one of my first tasks as Goodwill Ambassador, is for when I would say UNHCR, that the response wouldn't be, oh, UNESCO. Oh, you mean UNICEF. So UNHCR. And he left me with lots of material about the organization. And as I began to read through it, I thought, oh, this is something that I could do that could connect me to something that I believe strongly in, which is human rights. I grew up in the south of the United States at a time of America's apartheid. I witnessed the civil rights movement that was led by Martin Luther King and inspired by many women. There are many women whose names you do not know, but you probably know Rosa Parks, but she wasn't the only one. There were many women that made this movement possible. But the name that everyone thinks about, of course, is Martin Luther King, and he was wonderful. I was too young to participate, but it was a movement that inspired me. And it was a movement that was inspired and really supported by the music of the slaves, the Negro spirituals, the music that was sung in church. Very often when people met in the church to go and march, knowing that they would be beaten and maybe killed, they left singing. And then as an adolescent, I began to be interested in women's movement and women's rights. When I came to the university, I was marching against the Vietnam War. So that began an activism in my own life. But I realized that there were many movements of human rights. Everyone was fighting for their own rights. And I thought, well, but it becomes sort of like a vicious circle, because I get my rights, that means I'm on top, but then somebody has to be on the bottom. And that must be something that exists where all rights are respected, where we can all be equal and different. And that is something that I found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which shares my birth date. And so we have celebrated our 70th birthday. I am 20 days older than the Declaration. It is my twin. But when I grew up, where I grew up, my parents never heard of it because we lived under other laws, which are called Jim Crow laws. So when the UNHCR came to me, I thought, this is a way that I can put into action what I believe about human rights. And it was supposed to be a one-year engagement, and it's been 32 years. And it is because from that very first meeting in a refugee camp in Zambia, I met refugees from Namibia who were preparing to go home for independence, and then another group of refugees from Mozambique who unfortunately stayed 14 years after that first visit before they were able to go home. That had been the kind of stories that we have with UNHCR, is that the preferred one is when people can go home because that's what they want to do. And unfortunately, we have too many stories where people have to stay in refugee camps, born there and for a long period of time. And so that is really how I got started with UNHCR, and it is a cause that has stuck to me. And I think that if I'm ever allowed to retire, I would still be an activist for refugees, because that is a cause that has attached itself to me. It chose me, so that is why I am still here. And I can say that it is a giving, but it is so much in return. I would say that I'm firstly inspired by my colleagues. Many colleagues, it's a hard life being in the field. It's not very good for successful marriages. That's just the truth of the matter. But because of the schizophrenia of the life of being in the field, and then having to come home and maybe not wanting to bring what you've experienced in the field to the dinner table, and on the other hand, having to be separate from your family. So the people who I've met are people who are devoted, and some have given their lives for the cause of refugees. So firstly, my colleagues, and then the refugees themselves, particularly the women, because they're vulnerable, and yet with enormous dignity and courage, they face the difficulties that they're confronted with, usually for the sake of the children, and sometimes members of their family. So they never give up. They keep struggling, even when there are no solutions that are evident. And so I think that when I come home to the comfort of this beautiful scenery, I can't give up either.
Thank you. And so you mentioned a couple of situations, but of course you have, during these more than 30 years that you have been supporting the cause of refugees, I know that you have traveled quite extensively. I know it's a difficult question because also you've been in so many places. I just thought if I was asking myself this question also wouldn't be easy to answer it. But what do you think might be the most moving situation that you have visited, refugee situation that you have visited in your long career with UNHCR?
Well, you're right, it's hard because there are many, but there's one that comes to mind. It's when I started with UNHCR, my children were small, and one of the things that would happen when I would meet refugee children, that was difficult for me not to replace the faces of my own children in their faces. And I was in Tanzania, in Ngara, after the genocide in Rwanda, in a feeding center for children who had malnutrition. And there was a mother who was breastfeeding, and at her side was a 4-year-old who was slowly dying of malnutrition. And to look into her eyes and see this dichotomy of despair, on one hand, hope for the child she had at her breast, and despair for the one that was seated at her side. And they told me that it's not always the weakest child that doesn't survive. It's the one who has lost the light in his eyes. And I could see that this child no longer had light in his eyes. And it was, on one hand, I had to be strong into that situation. And looking into that mother's eyes was something I'll never forget. And I don't know, but I do really hope that she is well, and that the child that she has at her breast, who's probably an adult now, is also well.
That's a very truly moving story. But so you are a classical singer. We're here in Art Verbier, so I wondered whether you could share some thoughts with us about how you see the connection between art and refugees.
Well, I'll first start out by saying that the question of art was one that came to my mind as I was doing my studies, because I did my studies in science. I have my degree in chemistry and mathematics. I received, a year before I was to graduate from university, a scholarship to go to a music camp in a place like this, in Aspen, Colorado, and to study with a fantastic teacher whom I had never heard of before, over a 9-week period. At the end of that time, she offered for me to come to the Juilliard School to be a student. Of course, I had to apply and be accepted by the school, but she said that she would accept me as her student. Her name was Jenny Terrell. And so I finished my university studies. I applied to the Juilliard School and received this full scholarship to study. And so as I was embarking on that first year, it was an empty screen in front of me. It was really a jump of faith, because I had no idea what my future was going to be. But I thought I was young enough to be able to take that chance. I finished university at the age of 20, and I thought all my professors said, if it doesn't work out, you're welcome to come back and get a doctor's degree. So, but then I began to think, if this is something I'm going to do for my life, it must have some meaning for my life. And as a teenager, my father was pastor, and so I started singing in the church. But I was quite a rebellious teenager. But then when I started to think about this, I realized that I was a lot more Protestant and a lot more like my father than I wanted to admit, because it was important for me to have some meaning to my life and to this profession that I might have, other than my own pleasure. Because I'd always sang. I sang since I was able to speak, and it always gave me great joy, and it still does today. So the encounter I had with this teacher, Jenny Terrell, was so important, because watching her, because she was still singing, prepare her music, I began to realize that I wanted to become an artist, because she was an artist. And for me, that definition was someone who was at the service of their art and their talent. And then, but what is really art for me, and why should that be something noble enough for me to dedicate my life to? And over the years, the answers came. Well, it is that conversation that was started from the beginning of time between human beings. It is this language that is necessary, and art is as necessary to life as the air we breathe. And then we come to the human rights. And I would say that in a performance, there are moments, not through the whole concert, but there are moments where I really feel the audience and the musicians are vibrating together. We're listening with the same ear. My science comes back to me, and I happen to believe, I have my own theory of the string theory, is that it all began with one single vibration and that we're all trying to get back to that vibration. And in that moment, we are vibrating together. And it is, in my opinion, from that place where we vibrate together that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has sprung. So I don't do two different things. Being an activist and being an artist is the same thing. So it is only natural that in that moment where I feel that we are vibrating together and being reminded that we're all a member of this family which is called humanity, it is that in that moment that we know that she's my sister, he's my brother, that's my child. And that's all you need to do and to know to work with refugees. It's all you need to know to find the solutions, which are difficult, complex, because refugee problems are usually political problems. They demand political solutions. They demand a political will. But if you don't forget that we are the same, it makes it easier for us to create those solutions.
Maybe a last question. We've talked. The word refugees has come up quite a bit during our conversation, and now is a phenomenon and a word that, of course, is recognized by most people in the world. But of course, there is another aspect of the work of UNHCR, which you also know well, but which unfortunately is very little known around the world, and it's the issue and the phenomenon of stateless people who have been denied nationality, or whose nationality has been stripped away from them. And I know that you're also very interested in this issue. Would you like to say a few words about that issue?
Well, I think, well, when our Antonio Gutierrez, who was our last High Commissioner and who's now the Secretary General of the UN, talked about starting a campaign to end statelessness. I immediately wanted to be a part of it because I think I know what being stateless feels like. I feel that I was in some way born a refugee in my own country, born stateless because I was not a full citizen. The Constitution said that slaves were 3/5 of a person. And I guess that's about as stateless as you can get. And also because I really like trying to crack hard nuts. And statelessness is a hard nut to crack because people don't quite understand what it means. They think, is that an SDF, or does that mean they're homeless? I just know it means they belong nowhere. They have no nationality. No one will protect them, and no one claims them. It is like being invisible. So I have been trying to work on this campaign. It's the 5th anniversary. We have a long way to go, but we have made progress. We have made progress in countries in Africa. Well, I would just maybe to help you understand how a person can be stateless. In some countries, only men have the right to register their children at birth. And if the man doesn't do it, even though the mother is a citizen of the country, the children are born stateless. And in several countries in West Africa, they've made the decision to give the right to women to register their children and their own nationality upon birth. Now that has really diminished the number of stateless people. Statelessness can also be caused by a country deciding that a group of people are no longer citizens. This is what happened to the Rohingyas in 1982 when the Burmese government decided that they would no longer they were no longer considered to be citizens because they couldn't prove that they had been there long enough, and other rules that they made. So people can become stateless when, after colonialism, when arbitrary lines were drawn for countries, and that people didn't bother or didn't know that they should register somewhere. But statelessness means you can't have a bank account, you can't go to school, you can't get married. You can't even receive money. People can't send money to you because you have nowhere where you can go to cash a check that's been sent to you. So it's a state of non-being, and it's something that I would really like to make a difference in. We've got 5 years to meet our goals, and we're going to still work toward that. It's one of the things that's rewarding about working with an organization like the UNHCR is that, you know, if you look at the numbers, nearly 69 million people displaced in the world, 21 million are refugees, but you have to look at the one family you're able to help, the one child who you're able to help find their parents, because otherwise it is overwhelming. 69 million, I mean, that's more people than are in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden together. You know, so if you think all of those people are or displaced or refugees, but if you bring it down to that one person, that one family, and I'm often asked by people, what is it that I can do? You know, not everyone should go and work in the field. It's hard work. But I would say that your task is the person that is sitting in front of you at any time. That is at your kitchen table, at your office, maybe in a shop. If you spread from your heart the love you have, then I think that will spread out. And we will have a kind of a love movement, but a movement of humanity. And it's so that is sort of how I've done my work. And another thing I wanted to mention, since we're talking about art, is the importance of refugee artists. That teacher, Jenny Turrell, was a refugee. She arrived on the last boat that left France, escaping the Second World War. And without her, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So refugees, and particularly the artists, not only are they enriching us because we enjoy their music, we enjoy their art, but they are also teaching us. They're teaching us what it means to be a human being. And we have to be so grateful. I am so enriched by the experience that I have working with refugees. And as I said, without Jenny, I wouldn't be here.